Yes. And so we have Enrico Schaefer, who, gosh, been doing stuff with us for how long, Enrico?
Too many years to count.
Anyway, so what we were going to talk about, we've been, as you know, since mid-March, is COVID-19 themed stuff. And so when I approached you about coming on the show, I said, do you have something that can fit into that box? And you said, indeed, I do. And so you've been handling some cases with, I'm not sure what the term STR stands for.
Short-term rental.
Short-term rental, thank you. But anyway, so you're specifically working with some clients in the Airbnb space, and I watched your YouTube video, and I'm not a lawyer, so it got a little complicated for me. So I'm hoping you can simplify the situation on what's going on. Obviously, a lot of people, for instance, when I book an Airbnb, I tend to book it well in advance. And then they require money well in advance. Yep. Well, and then suddenly we have COVID-19. So explain.
So exactly. So what happened is a lot of people had reserved reservations on Airbnb. And so you've got three parties. You've got the host who owns the property, who does all the work, right? You've got the traveler or the guest who's booking the property, and then you've got the platform, Airbnb. And what happened is that the hosts have the ability to choose the cancellation policy, and then the travelers have the ability to pick a flexible cancellation, a moderate, or a strict. And a strict cancellation policy, no refunds. Actually, it's a 50-50 split of the refund, but if you're within 14 days or so, then it's 0% refund. But right. If you cancel long enough, you split that risk 50-50 with the host. So when COVID came along, Airbnb, as you might recall, was just on the cusp of filing with the SEC for an IPO, right? Which they were going to do in May. So when all of a sudden COVID happened, Airbnb decided they were going to ignore the cancellation policies of the hosts and refund what was initially like $1 billion and now is like $3 billion in reservations to the travelers, despite the fact that the travelers and the hosts had already agreed to split that 50-50, right? And of course, why did Airbnb do that? Because it has an IPO coming up and it wants those travelers to come back to them, not to VRBO, not to Booking.com, who honored the contract between the host and the guest. Now, Airbnb is just asking, they're acting as an escrow agent for that money. They have no interest in it. So for them to come and say, you know what, we as the escrow get to decide whether or not we're going to refund that and override the strict cancellation policy is a problem for a lot of hosts who are, by the way, dealing with it with their guests directly before Airbnb stepped in to mess everything up. So there's about $2 billion worth of host claims out there. And we're handling those claims for Airbnb hosts, property managers using Airbnb, et cetera.
Wow. So where does that stand? I mean, how long has it been going on and where is the case now?
So this is where the tech aspect comes in, right? Because Airbnb, like all other platforms, has a no class action clause, no collective action and arbitration clause, and you must arbitrate using consumer arbitration any claims that you have with them. So Airbnb's model is under the terms, you have to file individual consumer arbitrations. So we've been doing this for 3 months. We have hundreds of hosts. We're trying to get to 10,000 hosts, filing 10,000 arbitrations on the choke on this model, because 10,000 arbitrations to Airbnb is at least $100 million, if not $300 million, just in transaction costs, not to mention the $2 billion in liability they already have. So we're basically taking the position that hosts, you do have power. If you act collectively to assert your individual rights, you can bring Airbnb to its knees. And that's what we're doing, and we're well on our way to making that happen.
So how are you contacting these hosts? Are you advertising for this, or how is this being handled?
So I'm a host, which is how I got involved, and I happen to know this space really well, so it was a perfect combination for me. But as a host, I'm the one that got the email from Airbnb apologizing the day after they told all the guests you can get refunds. they did it without even telling the host, right? So I immediately looked at the terms of service, and I saw that the terms of service had a exception where Airbnb could in fact refund money called the extenuating circumstances policy. And in it, it said, one of the reasons they can give a refund is an endemic, ENDEMIC. And I thought, well, what's an endemic? And I looked it up, and it's the opposite of a pandemic. So Airbnb specifically excluded pandemics from a refund event. And I thought, okay, well, that's a breach of the terms. 4 days later, I went back to look at it again, and all of a sudden it said pandemic. So Airbnb changed the terms of service, didn't provide any notice that they required 30 days notice under the terms of service, then pretended as though the extenuating circumstances policy always said pandemic, hid that change, and then tried to apply this new policy retroactively to existing reservations. Well, at that point, I was all in, right? Because it was breach, it was fraud, it was you name it. And so these hosts, to answer your question, Matt, they're just finding us. I did a blog post on the endemic issue, and it just really got picked up heavily in the press and with hosts and social media. And all of a sudden, Enrico Schaefer was the champion of Airbnb hosts, finally fighting back against the big evil platform.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, this became kind of personal for me. I was off last week, and my wife and I had planned this really epic, like 11-day road trip where we're going to drive to Montreal, and then we're going to go to Maine, and then we're going to come back through Niagara Falls. And, we had Airbnbs in both the, historic section of Montreal and in a little lake in Maine. And when we canceled like 6 weeks before the trip. And Airbnb said, well, we'll give you half your money back in cash or all of your money back in Airbnb Credit that you have to use by the end of 2021. Well, we opted for Airbnb Credit, and instead last week we just drove 3-4 hours. We just drove 3-4 hours to northern Michigan and rented a cabin,
Well, I'm glad you did
used
that.
the credit to do that. So
because most of those credits will go unused. So think about that. That's part of the fraud that Airbnb engaged in, because they have no interest in the payouts that belong to hosts. They hold that money in escrow, right? So when they gave the refunds, they didn't tell the travelers like you, oh, by the way, you can have a refund. What they did is they pressured and created a funnel which pushed you into a travel credit, which industry standard is 50% never get used. Yeah. That means Airbnb now has
I'm going to use mine, payout, I can tell you that.
Right. Yeah. They have my host payout, which they stole from me if it goes unused. And then with the travelers, they made this big public relations that they refunded all the money. And the reality is most of the guests went through a bunch of screens which pushed them into a travel credit and buried the refund link at the bottom. So they weren't doing guests any favor either. And our view is, like, if Airbnb wanted $2 billion worth of goodwill with travelers, they should have paid for it themselves. They shouldn't have used host money to do it.
Interesting.
So I don't host folks, so I don't know the intricacies. So how does that actually work for a host? They when someone books a unit, as it were, then how much goes to Airbnb? How much goes to the host? How does that all play out?
So Airbnb takes a fee from both the host and the guest in order to use the platform. So I can't remember what the percentages are, but it's not insignificant. It's billions of dollars per year that hosts pay to Airbnb for using the platform. And it's billions of dollars by travelers who pay to book through the platform. And so they have a fee that they have an interest in on both sides of the transaction. And then the reservation amount, the payout to the host, they just hold as a fiduciary, as an escrow agent for the transaction between the host and the guest.
Okay. So sounds a little bit like what Ticketmaster does then.
Yeah, and so the other piece of this is that a lot of platforms really had this problem. Booking.com and VRBO, they didn't give any refunds. So for Airbnb, this was a great opportunity for them to use host money to buy a bunch of goodwill with travelers on the basis that they paid the refunds. They didn't pay anything, right? They may have waived their fee. But a lot of different platforms had this problem when COVID hit, of revenue. And to the extent that they were cycling someone else's money, all of a sudden they didn't have enough money to pay the people that they owed. And so we're really seeing a big uptick in these consumer arbitrations across all platforms. And think about this. This will be the first time where users of a platform fought back collectively against a platform, because users are powerless, right? All their rights are taken away in the terms of service. They can't bring a class action. Those are enforceable, those class action waivers. So what are they supposed to do? Well, our view is if you are smart about it, you can actually, you're bigger than Airbnb as host, right? As long as you're acting collectively. And then you can really get a seat at the table. From our point of view, our own table. We just want a seat at it to be able to create accountability and transparency.
Okay, I put a little over a minute or so left. So why don't you talk a little bit about how folks can reach out to you if they're Airbnb hosts and they want to get involved. Now, is this sort of turned into a class action lawsuit essentially, or what is it?
Well, it's not, because they're barred under the terms of service, but it is in the sense that we're acting collectively through individual arbitration. So we're filing, we represent hundreds of hosts. We're filing dozens and dozens of arbitrations every month. And so by doing these individually, we're following the rules that they set, but driving transaction fees to Airbnb that'll be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you want to contact me, you can go to traverselegal.com. Traverselegal.com is in Traverse City, Traverse, legal.com. You'll find we have a whole page on Airbnb and the COVID refunds.
Traditional four-year students love Lawrence Technological University's thriving campus life, but LTU has always met non-traditional students' needs too. Lawrence Tech offers over 100 degree and certificate programs that can get adult students started or back on track. And most of our classes are conveniently offered evenings at our beautiful Southfield campus or online, so you can balance your social, family, and work life even while you power up your career. Lawrence Tech, where Blue Devils dare.